Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Cindy Zulsdorf with NAB Show Exhibitors webinar and Kokoro Marketing. And today we're here with David Fowler from Act On Software. Hey, David.
Morning. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being with us today.
Sure.
So we are looking at GDPR, and let's get right into it. What the heck does GDPR stand for, and what are maybe the top few points we should know about?
Sure. So it's great to be here today. Thank you for your time. The GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulations. And really, in a nutshell, it's a complete rewrite of the digital legislation landscape within the European Union. The last time that was done was 20 years ago. So it's a massive overhaul of the current digital regulations that basically nurture the entire digital channel within the European Union.
Wow, and we have a mix of companies here on the call. Some are based in North America, some in Europe, South America, Asia, really all over the place. Does it matter where you're located with respect to GDPR?
No, it does not. If you have any European data in your database, then you will be required to adhere to the GDPR regulation. So, for example, Act On Software, the company I work for, we have 500 clients over there, and we have customers that have European data subjects in their files. So we have to comply as well.
Got you. Now, most of us are going to be at the NAB show in April in Las Vegas. We were just talking about the great drive down through the desert to that show. And how does it affect trade shows? You got someone walking in your booth, they hand you a business card, use the scanner, maybe you've got some other way of lead gathering. What happens next, and how does that matter in terms of GDPR?
So there's two things that you have to consider. First of all is the data that you already own in your database today. And then it's the addition of data that you're going to acquire through trade show or other events. So one of the obligations of the data controller under GDPR is if you own the data, essentially you control the data. So you'd be the data controller, is to ensure that you have consent and can prove consent on all the records that you have come May the 26th. If you don't have consent or can't prove it, then essentially at the very bare bones minimum, you are not in compliance. So there's two things you need to think about. First of all, is you need to think about your existing databases and how you have acquired consent over the years, where that data sits. So you need to do an analysis of what you have, where it is, how old is it, do you really need it? And those types of events or those types of activities. And then obviously when you start to think about growing your database at shows, etc., you have to find a way to obviously obtain affirmative consent within a booth. So for example, one of the things that we're doing, Act On, is essentially, we do the same thing. We go to European shows, we collect data on European individuals. One of the things we're doing is basically having sign-up forms, electronic sign-up forms in our booth. So when someone visits our booth, we can have a sign-up, we can have a documentation that someone gave consent at a certain period of time and for what specific reason. So, that may be different for different verticals, but the reality is at the end of the day, if you can't prove consent, then you're not in compliance.
So that sounds like, sometimes I'll be at a show and I'll see a person on the aisle, just like, hey, can I scan your badge? Hey, can I scan your badge? Hey, would you like this cool pen? Kind of a interchange or exchange happening. Right. Have you seen that, and what do you think? So
I think what the GDPR does is it basically sort of molds you into better thinking of how you digitally acquire consent. So the chances of everyone walking in your booth in Vegas being from the European Union is pretty low, I would imagine, right? But what you will end up with is a database of non-European Union subjects and potentially European Union subjects. So again, it's one of those things where the letter of the law states one thing, but in practicality speaking, it's a different scenario. So again, trying to be able to provide consent in a sort of non-consent way is going to be somewhat difficult for a lot of people to get their arms around initially. But what you will begin to see, and this is something that I think is long overdue, is you'll start to get contractual language in your event documentation that allows for you to jump on that individual as they walk past your booth, knowing the fact that they've agreed to opt in to certain types of data. So what the GDPR does is it basically forces down the consent chain, meaning everyone's sort of on the hook now for, a good ombudsman from a consent perspective. Right. So one of the things that GDPR is requiring of you to do is have third-party data agreements in place with your vendors. So in the trade show example, if I was running the trade show, knowing that I'd have a European audience attending, one of the line items in that documentation would be something along the lines of opting into, emails or digital messaging. So you'll begin to see those things happen, I think.
And I see on the, and we can let Nick, if you want to speak to it at the end, I see when a person signs up to come to NAB Show, there are some tick boxes that let them select some various things, but it's quite simple language.
Right.
David, I wanted to circle back to your comment about the audience at NAB Show. And so, yes, well, a substantial number of the folks at the show are from North America. We do have a lot of European visitors at that show. And can I say, I can see on this call, we've got some companies based in UK and other as well. And a lot of us on this call, I recognize so many people, I've seen at IBC at the Amsterdam show. And so a chunk of us, while we're at NAB Show, we'll all meet up in September at the RAI and do that show as well. So it's everything you're saying super relevant to us here on this call. We just are coming out of ISE in Amsterdam and BVE in the UK and stuff as well.
Right. I mean, it's a very hot topic now because it's, as I said, it's the biggest rewrite of the digital law. In fact, right now in Europe, there isn't a one law fits all for all countries. It's a directive. It's a misunderstanding or a understanding of a directive that's applied to local laws at an in-country level. So, come June 1st, when GDPR goes live, you'll have one law that is applied to every country within the European Union. And obviously that will be in place and also within the UK until the Brexit occurs. And when that occurs, we'll have to go down that road as well. But, there's 99 articles in the law. There's 11 chapters. There's 173 recitals. If you haven't read it and, you have two options, read the GDPR or watch paint dry. I mean, I would go with option B, right? Because the reality is it's just a massive piece of legislation. But the good thing is, and I think for all of us who are in the marketing space, is that it sort of allows us now to think about getting consent in a way that is communicated appropriately to the end user. I think in the US, over here, we operate in an opt-out world, right? Where we don't necessarily have to get consent before we start to market to folks. And that's a complete reversal of pretty much the rest of the planet. So for a US marketer like myself, who has a very large portion of my business in the European Union, it's really getting us to rethink a few of these things as it relates to onboarding clients, reaching out, et cetera. Because one of the things that GDPR is that as the recipient of the individual, you can tell the marketer what you're willing to accept from them. So you can actually say, yes, I'll accept an email, but I don't want you to call me or send me something in the letter, right? So profiling and being able to manage your user experience in a more in-depth way is certainly in play now.
Does that mean that companies need to be able to set up preference centers and that type of thing that talk about communication and that sort of thing? Could you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So really what you'll end up to, and you're beginning to see this, I mean, I've seen, you mentioned you have some folks on the phone from the UK, you're beginning to see this in advertising about re-opting in to preference centers, being able to say, hey, send me, I like to have some jeans, but I don't necessarily want tennis shoes. Or I'm not interested in coats, but I'll take the bicycle email, for example, right? And that's obviously, I'm sort of drilling that down, but the point being is you will be able to see now the adoption of more in-depth B2C retention-based strategies in an acquisition world. And that's kind of a different kind of play. But the point being is the vehicle for that is certainly going to be the preference center, right? So something to think about. Another thing you can't do under GDPR is have any kind of pre-checked consent boxes.
Right.
So the days of having something pre-checked are going to be over. So you can't do that either. Again, because that's kind of opting out, not opting in. So.
Right, and some of the language I've seen, and it could have been in one of your articles, and Fallon just popped a link to one of your recent articles on GDPR in the chat here. I saw wording around implicit opt-in and explicit opt-in, and that wording really kind of explains it, but maybe just touch on that a little bit, because you see that wording.
Sure, so there's different levels of consent, right? So explicit consent is, I'm opting in for this webinar, and that's all I really want. Right. Yeah. Implicit meaning I'm kind of maybe a little bit interested in the webinar, but I really want the white paper. Right. So as a marketer, you're going to want to get explicit consent based on your activity, meaning double opt-in, which you'll have to be required to get double opt-in in the EU anyway, but also being able to communicate to that individual that you are signing up for this, you will receive this, and the frequency will be, in this particular manner. So as explicitly as you possibly can get, then it takes off the table any misconception from the individual about signing up for certain things. And when you think about, we as marketers, we put our marketing hats on, right? We think about the low-hanging fruit of consent. The low-hanging fruit of compliance is consent, right? So if you have someone who complains about you, it's easy for a data protection authority to basically track that consent mechanism and say, hey, Cindy, can I see the opt-in form? And if you don't have it, then that opens up a massive conversation that you don't necessarily want to have with the data protection authority. And it'll be those things that trigger activity, in my opinion, within the data protection organizations around the European Union. And we saw that here in the US, and we saw it in Canada, right? When CanSpam over here and KSAL in the north. So it's easy to track consent, it's easy to track the management of consent, and it's also easy to request documentation. So low-hanging fruit, those are the things that I think are really going to trigger up or trip marketers up at some point.
Gotcha. Now, talking about consent, a lot of us on this call, we've have databases that go back 5, 10, even 20 years that could have originated from a Rolodex with some business cards. We've got some salespeople with some Excel spreadsheets that they're keeping for themselves, right, that maybe aren't in the company CRM.
Yeah,
I'm sure
big deal
has that, but yeah, I've just seen it once or twice. And
right.
What do we do with that? It's like I've got this database of people I met from Sky and Fox and BBC from 15 years ago.
Right.
What to do?
Do you really need it? Is the question, I guess, under GDPR, right? So under GDPR, you have to have consent on every piece of data you have.
Okay.
So a data inventory would be a really good place to start, right? What do you have? Where is it? Who has access to it? How old is it? And then you need to make a decision. And I think a lot of marketers are struggling with this right now in terms of, do I try to repermission my database now? Or do I wait until, March, April, May time? And that really is up to, I have companies that are doing it now, and I have companies that are going to wait right to the last minute. Because if you repermission your database, what's going to happen, right? You're going to lose a massive chunk of it. And that's a massive asset that you may or may not, be required or be prepared to lose. So the other thing you can think about is maybe trying to have re-engagement campaigns on the data that you own. Mm-hmm. And we talk about this in email a lot, meaning I have this list, it's a year old. What can I do with it? Can I send it? Can I mail to it? And the reality is that, yes, you can, but the longer that, or the older that data is, the less likely it is that they're going to actually engage with your brand. So you may get 3, 4, 5% of your data back, but at the end of the day, you're going to lose a large chunk of it. So, and that's something that, especially if you're doing co-branded marketing with other companies, right? If you're doing multifaceted marketing, they are also on the hook for compliance with your efforts as well. So as I said earlier about the consent being pushed downstream, you're going to have contracts in place with your vendors that will agree to compliance in the GDPR based on whatever relationship you may have with them as well. So find out where your data is, do the analysis on your database. Again, if you've got some Wild West spreadsheets flying around, find out where they are, bring them back into the fold. and put some policies in place that, hey, it's okay to market, but we've got to put a framework around this a little bit more than we currently have. Because again, low-hanging fruit of compliance are things that the rogue sales rep is going to reach out, and if you can't prove consent, then you're not in a good spot.
Now, does that mean that rogue sales rep who has his or her Excel spreadsheet that they're hanging on to, can they just go ahead and email them a one-off emails? Does that apply to this, or is it really just applying to marketing emails?
As it's essentially it's applying. So there's been some conversation around, is this B2B or B2C focused, right? And the reality is both, right? But what I said earlier when we kicked off the call, the spirit of the law versus what's going to happen. And we saw this in the US, right? So in the US, we had CAN-SPAM that went into effect in 2004. You had the Federal Trade Commission in 2006 define certain facets, and under CAN-SPAM, things like a PO box is a physical address, right? So now you'll start to see guidance that comes out after these activities occur within the data protection authorities at the European level. So if you feel you can roll the dice on a B2B versus a B2C email or a B2C database, then that's really your call, right? And some companies will make that decision. I will forward to you after this call a thread that I responded to a client of mine yesterday, and you could share it with the group. But the point being is that you're right. I mean, it's a gray area, right? And laws aren't always black and white. There's a lot of gray in them. But you don't want to be you certainly don't want to be the company that takes it on the chin for the rest of us if indeed you make a decision based on a certain business policy. And by the way, the fines under GDPR are huge, right? It's 4% of global turnover for a company, or 20 million euros, whatever's the most amount. So if you're Google, right, 4% of a gazillion dollars is a lot of money. Can you afford 4% of your business if you're a $50 million business? I don't know. So it's really interesting, because it's basically getting everyone to sort of think in a very structured way, but yet we all work in this digital channel. That's great, but the problem is what's really going to happen that we don't really know. The big thing to think about, and not wanting to depress anybody on the phone here, but the GDPR is interesting, but what's really going to be interesting is going to be what's called the e-privacy directive. And that's the cousin to GDPR. And if that goes live in January of 2019, that's a complete rewrite of the cookie law. So any business that uses cookies for consent, any businesses uses cookies for their infrastructure, their business model, are going to have to get consent on every cookie that's placed on a website or a phone or an email. So that's going to be it's going to be a bigger deal.
And so for folks who have a database, most of us have databases where we've got people in there and we don't know what country that person resides in. Is there a suggested plan of attack around that?
Well, I mean, most CRM databases have, maybe some triggers where you could do a, cross-reference lookup as to where they may be geolocated, et cetera. But again, sooner than later, if you're going to do a re-engagement campaign, hey, update your profile. There's nothing wrong with sending out, a informational email or informational outreach. Say, look, we're trying to figure out our database. Fill in the blank if you'd like to or not, right? And consent is interesting. It's once you get it, as a marketer, we tend to, not necessarily abuse it, but we have to be in a point now where we set the appropriate expectation around frequency, volume, outreach, and all these other things that we don't necessarily really think too much about over here. So I think one of the things that we're doing on our forms is maybe putting some geo information on the sign up. We're looking for, things that could trigger certain countries of origin or, other types of data sets that may give us some insight. And if we don't have that, then I think we're just going to shelve it. And that's just a business decision that we've made, right? Yeah, so, it's sort of buyer beware when it comes to, certainly data acquisition and certainly rental of data. Those two markets should be dried up relatively quickly within the European Union after GDPR goes live.
Yeah, so a lot of trade shows do list rental through the lead gathering company. So a third party lead gathering company will say, hey, I'll send out this email on your behalf. Am I responsible now for their practices? I don't know who's on their list.
Yes, you are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
important for all of us on this call to know, because
Right.
that is a big practice in the broadcast and media industry.
Right. So Acton is primarily a marketing automation platform that allows organizations to essentially build lead nurturing campaigns on certain data sets, right? So we are clearly in that orbit. So the thing that we are thinking about, and obviously in this country, renting or acquiring data from a third party is not illegal. It's not a best practice, but it's certainly not illegal.
Right.
But we saw when Castle went live in Canada that just as our business practices, we just said, look, we're not going to do any kind of data acquisition through third parties for Canadian recipients because we just can't trust the sources.
Yeah.
Right. And so if you have a vendor who can't show you the consent mechanism that they have on the list, then my advice to you would be buyer beware. Right. So,
Gotcha.
But again, it forces compliance down within the industry as well. So I think we'll see a lot more of that going on.
Yeah. So this is awesome. We've got a lot of questions, or a few questions anyway, coming in through the chat. And so I think we'll just go ahead and have a little transition into QA, if that's okay with you, David.
Sure.
All right. So one of the questions ties right into what you're talking about, and just maybe underscores your point a little bit. How often should you ask for reconsent? Is there a benchmark on what that should be?
I think a lot depends on what your program is going to do, what your achievement is, or your benchmark, right? So, I mean, best practices would state that once you engage, you onboard a recipient, you have their attention, right? So it's a really good thing to start to set that expectation around, hey, Sydney, thanks for signing up. I'm gonna communicate with you every week or once a month, or whatever the case may be. It will give you the power to set the expectation in your shop as opposed to me telling you what I'm going to do for you. So regaining consent would be certainly an indication of engagement from that user. So if that's a 3-month decision you make or 6-month decision you make, I don't think there's any formula for any particular organization. But you should try that, because again, an engaged client is going to be a repeat customer, right? And the ROI on that engaged customer is going to be far more than it would be if you haven't set the appropriate expectation right from the start of the digital relationship.
That makes sense. And this is something we're all thinking about. A little tangent off here is what happens with targeted advertising, like remarketing or targeting ads like Facebook, all that type of advertising. How does that tie into GDPR?
So that's going to be more of an e-privacy directive kind of initiative, right? Where retargeting of electronic ads, et cetera, is all based on cookie consent. All right. And so, the right to be forgotten, those types of concepts, or the right for data portability, those types of concepts. I think it's going to be a battle royal in the market once the e-privacy directive is either aggressively passed or actually goes live, because that has a massive impact on the whole ecosystem. So I don't really have a concrete answer to that question, but I think we'll definitely see a lot more of those things coming along, and that clearly is on target for the browser market and other types of verticals that have a stake in the digital channel that really aren't talking about their particular position yet.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned about cookies on websites. Just for my understanding, I'll be on a website or be working with the client website, and that little message comes up that says, click here to acknowledge that this website uses cookies. Is that something that all of us need to be doing? Could you tell us about that? I realize it's not quite in line with GDPR.
Well, it is a subset of GDPR, essentially. Okay. So there is some commentary around that. So any European website you visit, you should see a disclaimer around accepting cookies for functionality purposes, right? When that actually went live, there was some countries that said, yeah, that's great, we'll adopt it. Some countries said, screw it, we're not going to do it. So depending what sites you go to, you'll either see that disclaimer or you won't, right? So when the Easy Privacy Directive goes live, every website will have some form of that and will have to adopt that mechanism. It also be deeper because it'll track you, and you'll have to gain consent as you're being tracked, right? So let's say you look at the shoes on Nordstrom website, you go to Tesco's, and all of a sudden the shoe ad pops up, right? The question is, if I present that ad on the Tesco website, have I got consent to do that? And that's really where I think there's going to be a lot of gray area that will definitely get tested out.
Yeah. I was listening to the Reply All podcast because it's just pretty fun, and they got into a whole thing about does Facebook, does Instagram listen to us and our ads popping up based on audio, which was so fascinating. And of course, that's, as I understand it, denied by Facebook. And yet I've had that experience myself, even yesterday, where something popped up that, when we were pondering, we said that out loud, but did we do anything else? Was there some geolocation? Was there anything else we did to indicate that? And that ad popped up in a minute. It was crazy.
Yep.
All right, let's look back to some other questions right here. For folks who have questions, just shoot them into the box here. David and I will stay on for a few more minutes. We want to be sure take care of everything you have. You can see that Fallon's putting into the chat box links to a checklist, a GDPR checklist that David has on his website, his company's website, as well as his most recent articles. So you guys can all go to that, and we can include these links on the replays as well. So you'll have access to those as well. All right.
If I could say, Cindy, as I said earlier, this is a very complex piece of legislation. So I would encourage anyone on the call to, seek a legal opinion on their obligations, and certainly not listen to me because I can't give you legal advice. But, at the end of the day, when these things get ironed out, it will get ironed out in the court of law in the European Union. And that will drive a lot more additional sort of, information and guidance and that kind of thing. And as we are based in the UK, we are using the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, as our data protection authority of record, and basing our preparation on some of the advice and guidance that they've given to date. So they've got a lot of information available, and I know I just saw the link in the chat box. I would encourage anyone to go there and certainly do some diligence and do some homework there, because they have a lot of stuff they talk about. But it's the closer you are to managing consent, to managing consumer data, the more risk you have under GDPR, in my opinion.
And now, does it matter the size? As we look at the callers here, we've got all different size companies, and how does that affect some of the responsibilities and the DPO stuff that you and I talked about last week? Does that matter on the company size?
You'll have certain obligations. If you have over a certain amount of employees, then you'll be required to have a data protection officer on staff. I believe that number is 250 and above. The hottest job right now in the UK, in the European Union, is outsourcing data protection. So if you do a Google search, you'll be inundated with job offers for that. But again, it's just common sense, right? I mean, we don't want to abuse this great channel that we sort of, that's our livelihood. But at the same time, our customers have the right, should have the right to manage their user experience. And when you think about, data and privacy from a European's perspective, it's built into the framework of the European Union. It's essentially saying, it's in the Bill of Rights of the European Union that you have a right to privacy. And that is a very deep and wide initiative that people get very sensitive about in the European Union. And, maybe not so much in the US, but certainly over there. And so that's really this whole thing, the genesis of this whole thing is coming from. And I think, I would much rather be a bit inconvenienced in terms of my marketing obligations, but ensure that I have a client that's going to re-engage with me on multiple occasions because I onboarded them correctly when they came in, as opposed to have someone engage me once and then leave, right? I'd rather have a repeat buyer 4 or 5 times a year if I've set that expectation out the gate than once and one and done.
I like your approach. It makes sense, and it really helps all the information you've given us today. If you were to give somebody, I know it's such a big piece of legislation, but if you were to give those of us on this call 1 or 2 pieces of what should I do first? The first 2 things I should do, what would that be?
Well, drink heavily initially. I think because we're in a data business, find out what you have, where it sits, how old is it, do you really need it anymore, right? If I have all these data points on Cindy and I only use your phone number, why am I have all these other sort of subsets about you? Delete what you don't need, permission what you have, and start to think about when you onboard new clients or onboard new data leads, bring them into programs that are transparent, over and above communication, meaning, here's the sign-up form, here's my privacy policy, you can opt out here, et cetera, and just be over-communicative as opposed to reactive. Because again, it's one thing if you make cars, it's another thing if I'm managing your data, it's going to be the individual's data that drives a complaint or inquiry as opposed to the wheel on an automobile. And so I think definitely do the data analysis is really key. And if you do one thing today, that's really what you need to do.
Nice. Thank you, David Fowler. So appreciate it. We'll be thinking of you as you give your keynote in Athens coming up. That's amazing. You're amazing to take time to be with our group today here at NAB Show. Nick, do you have anything you wanted to bring in, or I think we will wrap it up.
Just to quick note on that, as David and you mentioned, we do have a lot of demographic and geo data when attendees and exhibitors are both registering for the NAB show. Currently, at the moment, we are working with our legal staff to obtain the proper consent by the May deadline for GDPR. And we do look forward to being consent with that by the deadline, which conveniently is after the NAB show.
Better late than never.
Yes. So thank you both. And again, to Fallon, if you're still online, if you could just pop in my email for folks. If you have any exhibitor questions, any logistics questions about the show, I'm more than happy to help.
All right. With that, have a beautiful day, everybody, and thank you.